So I'm presenting EINCASM, a framework for studying emergent intelligence in neural cellular automata slime molds, long name. I'm Aidan, and my advisor is Rodrigo Canaan. So first off, just to preface, what is this work? What am I presenting here? Well, firstly, it's an extended abstract. So this is preliminary work, then a vision for the future and a framework for studying things. And I also present EINCASM, so implementation of this framework and some initial results about that. And then I look at where this can go and what sort of questions can we answer with similar systems. So first off, what is EINCASM? What are these component parts? So the first part, EI, emergent intelligence. Well, that's a combination of two things. Emergence, which is, for example, when you have water molecules that combine, and when you zoom out at large scale, you see a snowflake, which is unlike any of the water molecules. And intelligence, which I define just as being able to accomplish a goal in a wide range of environments. So emergent intelligence could be something like a civilization, where you have a ton of brains that by themselves are pretty good, but not as good as a civilization. But when they all interact together and you zoom out, that civilization is more generally intelligent. It can do more in a wider range of environments. The second part, NCA, we just had two great examples of neural cellular automata, so I won't go into it too much. But essentially, they're a grid that updates given local information and coordinates itself by communicating with their neighbors to do something at a larger scale that's beyond the zoomed in scale. And slime molds are awesome, first of all. They're this acellular or unicellular aneural organism. This has a very simple physiology and is able to do some pretty complex things with that simple physiology. So it can solve mazes, it can find nutrients in the environment and transport that nutrients in an optimized transport network. It can also learn things about the environment and transfer that knowledge to other parts of its organism, perhaps that have never seen that feature. So when you combine these things, you get EINCASM, which is a neural cellular automata that's housed in an environment that must eat to grow, so must find energy in the environment to replicate itself, to build more cells. And there's some physics around this growth and consumption. So it's not just free. It can't just magically reproduce itself places. It has to do certain things, and there's certain constraints around that. And some of these include transporting nutrients via fluid. So to get nutrients from a food source to somewhere else, it has to move it there. And communicate by sending signals. So this is the classic hidden channel that's repeated recurrently, shared between itself in the future and its neighbors. And to grow, it explores. So it has to find things in the environment. And to do this, it must solve problems. So if there's an obstacle or poison, it has to grow around that obstacle or poison. And to survive adversity, so say you remove part of it, or you add a new obstacle, it has to build robustness. So if you remove part of the network, it has to be able to still sustain itself and not rely on that one part of the network. So why do this? What can you study with a system such as this? Well, firstly, I think it's interesting to study the parameters around emergent intelligence. So if there's more food and so on, what does that change? Also, the coevolution of world models and language. So if you're trying to solve problems in an environment and you can share that with other parts of your organism, how do you do that? And then co-option or neural recycling, which is looking at that language. If you represent the world in one way, how do you use that representation in other contexts? And then also, how can you understand or build more powerful systems like this? So can you analyze society, civilization? So now let's dive into how it works, the system of EINCASM. So firstly, there's the environment. This contains obstacles, food, poison, and chemicals. So that's just around food. There's like a scent that smells good and a scent around poison that smells bad, although it learns good and bad. And this is all procedurally generated at different scales. You can see there's something that's kind of sparse and random, something that's very smooth and with big openings, and something that's very chaotic. So the second part are there these live channels. The first is cytoplasm, which is like a fluid that contains nutrients. This is how it moves around. This is what it pumps around. And then there's nutrient storage. So this is like cytoplasm that's congealed and is denser. There's also muscle or a reservoir, which is how much cytoplasm can it push out at once. and hidden channels, so communication, chemical signaling. And the first part of EINCASM is perception. So it has to sense something in the environment, as well as its neighbors' life cells and communication, and then send that to the physiology, which in this case is different from the other NCA papers presented so far. It's a compositional pattern producing network evolved with meat. So it's a much smaller network than these, like, I think the other ones have 8,000 parameters. So this is much smaller because we're looking for somewhat simpler behavior so far right now. And the actions it can do is it can store nutrients, so it can decide to congeal. It can pump cytoplasm to different directions, and it can communicate. The physics included, so once it makes these decisions, they're kind of capped off, they're put in boundaries and so on. Include first some fluid flow simulation. This is using the lattice-Boltzmann method. It's kind of approximated. It's a cellular automata sort of thing. It's a bit ad hoc, honestly. But that means that if it pushes fluid in one direction, it keeps on moving that direction for a bit. And there's also some energy cost to pumping. The more you move, the more nutrients it takes. And exchange rates. So food converts into some amount of cytoplasm and so on. There's numbers around all that, and caps. And finally, there's the evolution. So, well, actually, let's skip it. There's a life cycle. You have to live first before it can evolve. So first you inoculate the environment, then you explore, develop your network. So this is an example of a relatively simple agent that discovered a Voronoi diagram. So it just grows in all directions and then builds roads around the corners, which can already go around obstacles and build an okay network. And then throughout this, it has to survive adversity. So you remove parts of the network, and you change parameters around growth, make it more difficult, and it has to keep its structure until we decide to measure its fitness. And its fitness is measured by either the sum of nutrients that it stored, so how much mass is it accumulated, or, and this is yet to be implemented, but you give a signal after a period of growth and say, okay, now produce as much nutrients as you can. So you have a chance to convert your muscle, for example, into nutrient storage. This is like, say there's hot weather and it's a really good time to produce spores. So that's the system. And you can see we have some initial results. For the rest of this, I'm going to talk about why I do this. What can you explore with this? Because right now, this behavior that's happening is relatively simple, and we have systems that can do it better already. So what's the point in trying to build a system that solves these problems? Well, those are those first four things I introduced. Setting the parameters around when it starts to act intelligently and when it doesn't. The coevolution of world models and language, neural recycling, and more powerful systems. So on this first one, we can try to change the environments, say that some are very large, some are very small, maybe obstacles are complicated or not, and see how that modifies when intelligence emerges. So say that you're in a space with no obstacles, you probably won't learn how to solve mazes. At what point do you? If it's too complicated, it's not worth learning how to solve a maze because you can never get anywhere with it. Same thing with food availability. There's food everywhere. You don't have to optimize your network. And scaling variance. So say everything's really close by, you're just going to explore that area. Whereas if there's things close by and things far apart and things really far apart, and all of those scales, you have to learn how to operate on all of those scales if you want to really do well, which might include building other mechanisms too. The second part, coevolution of world models and language. This is really interesting, I think. And I think this is a conducive system for studying the initial aspects of this. So say that you are in this environment and there's food over there, but in front of that food is poison. And normally you don't really want to grow through poison because it saps away your nutrients. But every time there's food, there's also poison in front of it and like surrounded by obstacle. Well, the only way to survive is just to suck it up and go through that poison. So say that one part of the network sees this and learns this, but another part hasn't. Can that one part communicate to the other part, hey, I've learned this, grow through poison, try that out. And if it does, how does it do it? Can we see what language it forms to communicate things like this? Another thing is perhaps that there in a multi-agent environment. So there's other things trying to compete for nutrients, and you can block them by building obstacles and poison. Can you use your understanding of the world to build complex puzzles that only you can solve? And can we look at the language around this? So co-option or neural recycling. So when competing, so this is the point that I showed off first. So the neural recycling or the co-option aspect is you built this world model, perhaps spatial awareness, and then you use it for other functions higher up, like building a puzzle or for communicating more complex information. Think about how we use space and language all the time. In this final bit, how to build or understand more powerful systems. So for example, can you replace the model of the network with an LLM or something and have it forage in an information environment by communicating to each other and so on? Or some larger system that has similar properties, and can we study that? And then further, if we look at the simple system, can we learn something about the system that we're in or other complex systems, like the one that we're in, or civilization? So some future directions. Right now, we have the implementation mostly finished and some experiments working, but we want to develop some more rigorous experiments to study these above ideas, and then try and make some claims about how this appears in the system, which is very ideal because it's a small search space. Simul's are pretty simple. And then the second is multi-organism unindividuated simulations. So have multiple organisms with their own genome, and remove this idea of stopping it at some point and choosing with neat which ones to evolve. Just say, you over here have this genome and the one next to you is a little bit different. When you interact, you mutate a little bit and merge. There's some noise involved. And then that's the evolution inherently. And the more cells there are, the more you produce your own genome. And included in this is large worlds or more advanced weather. So have some areas that are hard, some areas that are easy, and so on. And you have to adapt to those different situations. And the weather changes in larger scales too. So you have to be able to survive very cold things and very hot things and do well in all those environments. And then, of course, as a lot of people have mentioned, moving beyond this discrete system. So going to something like particle linear or a particle system that has similar properties. And then for all of this, the funny part is optimization. So putting this on a GPU so you can run it for a lot longer, get results a lot faster and so on, which will always be an ongoing process. Included in optimization is a side note. Can you do this in hardware? Can you understand a system in software and then create something with fluid dynamics that uses fluid in the world and does something similar? I think that would be very interesting future work. Yeah, that's what I have, and I've talked a bit fast. Thank you.